Ready? Ready, guys? You guys ready? Uber Maven, by the way. Uber Maven! Less than 10 divines, man! So this series is meant to showcase some of the cheap options that can do all content in the game with around 10 divines put into a build. And I think this league is a little bit different than previously, so that unique items are just so available. So I think builds that usually would have cost 50 to 100 divines, that level of performance can be achieved at around the 10 divine budget this league. In general, I want all the builds to be relatively generalist, as opposed to being specialist builds, while still excelling in certain types of content. This right here is a charge stacking Slayer, and it's not just another charge stacking, though it's pretty similar. I'm only using unique items on this just as like a personal little side challenge to throw in here, but I think it's super effective, reaching almost 50 million DPS at around 8.5 divines, and getting pretty solid defenses, about 16k max fizz hit, 25k max elemental hit, with a ton of recovery with no conditionals up. So this is really solid, even by my standards. It doesn't have the best map clear, but it's a really effective bosser with explosive trap, and I can pretty much clear all content in the game, though T17s I'm probably rolling about 5-10 chaos on average before I find a map that's actually runnable to do. Not that this specializes in that anyways. And the build is really using the generic power charge setup, which, if you're not familiar, is using Void Battery, Malachi's Loop, Graven's Secret, Badge of the Brotherhood, Rallakesh's Impatience, and then a Militant Faith granting you Inner Conviction. That gives you a ton of baseline damage. But in addition to that, compared to other power charge stackers, this uses 3 really crazy efficient uniques. So firstly, most Slayers going for the setup will use Replica Restless Ward. This gives you a ton of regen and a ton of movement speed at no penalty, because you're bypassing the charge penalty for Frenzy and Endurance charges due to Badge of the Brotherhood and Masterful Form. Secondly, I'm running the Vertex. Vertex is really crazy for this build because it allows me to stay with a non-Eldritch Battery setup while still letting me run Divine Blessing Hatred. In my setup, Hatred gives me more than double damage, really great, and having a lot of ES is very good because I'm playing a build that is somewhat evasion based and still running Graven Seeker for ES recoup. So then having that source of energy shield is really powerful, especially with how efficient the energy shield mastery doubling your helmet is. Vertex also gives you a ton of chaos res. I think in general it's just a strong helmet that more people should be looking into at the lower end of budgets. The third final item this is using is Slave Driver's Hand. Now on the surface it only looks like about a 20% damage multiplier, which is still pretty good for a pair of gloves, but it allows us to do 2 more things. Firstly, Slave Driver's Hand gives a ton of trap throw speed, and this is sort of the obvious set, and it basically, if you think about it, in combination with charge traps and just the general stacking, allows you to triple dip the effectiveness of the charge stacking setup we're going for. Even though trappers aren't everyone's favorite playstyle, it's definitely the most efficient setup I can think of as far as the Rallakesh badge stacking Slayer goes. Secondly, it allows me to bypass life tap. Now, I'm not an Eldritch Battery setup as I previously mentioned, but I am able to really spam life cost because my regen is something like 1,000 to 1,100 with this particular setup. Slave Driver's Hand lets me use a real support instead of life tap on my chest, so that's another 20 to 30% more damage. In general, the combination of all these uniques just makes for a hyper efficient setup that's really well rounded. And the best thing about this build is that I think it's the most reproducible iteration of a 10 divine build. It doesn't use a single rare, as I've already mentioned. I've tended to avoid corruptions that are mandatory. I took off even the +1 power charge Vertex that I was running earlier, just because it's so scarce. And I think any player that wants to either play this build at this budget level, or push it much further into 100, 200, 300 million DPS range, without too much more additional investment, will have a really easy time doing so conceptually. So because this build is fairly straightforward, I'm going to go through things fairly quickly. One thing I really want to mention is this Vertex Corruption implicit. It was like 5k or something, and the reason I got this is actually not to enable Divine Blessing. It's only so that I can drop a 2% or 3% reservation efficiency jewel. The only thing this really gives me is the ability to reserve slightly less mana and still have more mana, so I can actually cast an Arcanist Brand Tricurse setup. Just a little bit smoother as far as things go. And because I'm playing Anathema, I actually have like basically infinite curse limit, so having that ability to cast certain things with my mana is still quite powerful. The Restless Ward here does have a corruption. There's quite a few things you can go for. Trap Mind Gems, AoE gems, or generic gems are all quite strong. Increased damage is good, max res, that sort of thing, all quite good. Slave Drivers doesn't even have a corruption at all. And then these have nothing, except for this Ventures. On the Ventures and the Gravens, I've gone for Hatred effect. There's other corruptions to go for because Hatred is just so powerful as an offensive aura. And, you know, these things are fairly cheap to go for. It's what I went for. There's other things that can be good or no implicit at all. I mean, Ventures is actually extremely troll to be having. An Amethyst Ring giving you some amount of Chaos Res would be much better. I just thought it was, you know, cute to have a fully brown build. As far as the jewels go, Interrogation is actually one of the most expensive, if not the single most expensive item on this entire build. it does give you brittle, and one of the cool things is that you're really easily able to overcap crit, basically. Even despite that I am running Piranha's Pack, because I'm choosing to skip crit chance in a few places, like up here, for instance. So you'll want to balance like your own alt ailment effect, your brittle effect, with how much crit chance you're building on the build. And for anything that's higher budget, I would never actually run this Piranha's Pack. Second shield, the Watcher's Eye, I'm using a Pen Watchers. Base crit Watchers tends to be better. Conversion Watchers can also be nice as well. Purity of Elements is actually the one I want to be running, probably, just to better enable Graven's Secret. Militant Faith, I really like having them reduce mana costs here. It makes running Divine Blessing much easier to do. Again, just something to balance, something to look for as you're iterating on the build. You might not be able to cast your Aura if you don't have the reduced mana cost of skills. Piranha's Pack down here, Global Crit Chance. I chose this one because it's the cheapest one that's still useful. Chaos Res is really good. Fizz damage is okay. Max Life is actually really strong as well. Those are sort of the three I'd be thinking about as far as Piranha's Packs go. I just think this shield is crazy efficient. And then I do play a Balance of Terror giving you Fizz as with Elemental Weak. There's also the Enfeeble Balance of Terror, which is quite strong. It's just nice to have, you know. I just think it's relatively efficient. It's super not mandatory necessarily, and honestly a Rare Jewel probably would outperform this since I'm so scarce on increased life. And then finally I do run Immutable Force because that gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of running different Pantheons. When I'm running T17s, this is really helpful in particular because it lets you swap to this one for, say, like, you know, all damage can poison maps. For crit maps, I take Solaris. For generic stuff, I'll take Lunaris. And I'll never ever take Brine King because I'm Purity of Elements immune. And same thing with the Minor Gods, but Immutable is just nice in that way. Obviously, a higher roll is better, but it's not a problem. Let's talk about the gem setup. It doesn't matter where things exist, just insofar as your Divine Blessing setup needs to live inside of your Vertex. The rest of it's a bit more flexible. This doesn't necessarily need to have life taps. There's actually one socket of flexibility. I got Period of Elements here as one of my auras, and then the curses. Assassin's Mark is here. I'm playing Elemental Weakness self-cast, so I have 2 curses being self-cast, and then I have 3 more curses being cast by my Arcanist Brand. The reason I go for this specific combination of self-cast versus trigger is that Assassin's Mark I always want to self-cast because it's permanent, and I can control it. So for something like, let's say Exarch, if you're doing 4 phases of Exarch, I don't really care about proccing Assassin's Mark on the Minotaur, but once I've cast this on Exarch, it's on Exarch for the rest of the fight, which is really convenient. Same thing with Awakener, so I don't need to recast that. I have Elemental Weakness self-cast because I need it to be self-cast for Balance of Terror's bonus, this extra Fizz as. You actually need to use the skill itself. And then for these 3 curses, I trigger them as such. Punishment's actually fairly weak in this. You can see in the config I only have 18% more, whereas usually it's somewhere around 30 to... I don't know, 30 to 40 depending on curse effect and stuff, but that's how this is with punishment. And the reason I'm doing this with punishment is because as far as Slayer goes, you have the 20% cull, so it's only applying the bonus damage between the health bar of 50% and 20% for the boss. And then the other 2 are just generic curses. I like Enfeeble. I think it's always good. I mean, if you can just run it for free, why wouldn't you? You know, just Archimand it. It's pretty chill. And then I have Explosive Trap down here, which is just nice to have this set up, but then I also keep an Explosive Trap of Shrapnel in my inventory. I don't actually bother swapping Conch to increase AoE for clearing. Honestly, it's just not my focus. I was still able to get about 2 billion XP per hour while running the Domination Breach Atlas, which isn't super fast. I think you're aiming for about 3 to 4 billion on a really fast clearing build like a Headhunter or Deadeye or like an Ignite build. But 2 billion isn't too bad as far as your leveling XP. And then finally I have this setup over here. Hydrosphere is just temporary for when I didn't have my Awakened Cold Pen leveled up, because it gives you exposure. But, you know, it's not that important because this build just has so much damage. I think it's really fun. I've had a ton of fun playing it, and kind of the thing about playing this build and the thing about playing late game Chapter is that you really want to focus what you're farming on. So for me, I'm running a mix of Uber Bossing, Forgotten Rotations, and today I'm probably just going to run a ton of June and try to speed farm Veiled Orbs. And if you're morally focused on like single target, if that's how you like to play Path of Exile, this is much more the build for that.